"There's no space inside, Mom," my daughter said at her wedding. Those 7 words cut deeper than any knife ever could, and what I did next made her cry tears she never expected to shed. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a small 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York, where the walls are thin enough to hear my neighbor's television through the night, and the radiator clanks like an old ghost refusing to rest. The morning light filters through my kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that's seen better decades. I wake up every day at 5:30, not because I have to anymore, but because my body has been trained by years of sacrifice to rise before everyone else's needs could pile up on my shoulders. That morning, the morning of Sarah's wedding, I stood in front of my closet holding the navy blue dress I'd bought 3 months ago. It wasn't expensive, just something I found at the discount store on Northern Boulevard, but I'd saved for weeks to afford it. The fabric felt smooth between my fingers, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine walking down that church aisle, sitting in the front pew where mothers are supposed to sit, watching my youngest daughter marry the man she'd been living with for 4 years. I remember brushing my silver hair in the bathroom mirror, the same mirror that had reflected my face through decades of worry lines and sleepless nights. My hands shook slightly as I applied the coral lipstick Sarah had once told me looked pretty on me, back when she still noticed such things, back when she still called me just to talk, instead of only when she needed something. The subway ride to St. Matthew's Church in Astoria took 45 minutes, and I spent every one of those minutes rehearsing what I would say when people asked where I'd been seated. I practiced smiling, the kind of smile that hides the cracks in your heart. The train car smelled like coffee and morning commuters, a mixture of hope and resignation that I understood all too well. I arrived at the church early, clutching my small black purse so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The building stood tall against the gray October sky, its stone walls weathered but dignified, like an old woman who has seen too much but still stands proud. White roses and baby's breath decorated the entrance, and I could hear the soft murmur of guests already gathering inside. That's when I saw her. Sarah, radiant in her flowing white gown, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style that must have cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. She was speaking hurriedly to someone I didn't recognize, someone in a black suit with a clipboard who looked important and busy. I took a step toward her, my heart swelling with pride and love. This was my baby girl, the same child who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, who made me Mother's Day cards with crooked letters that said, "I love you more than ice cream." I wanted to tell her how beautiful she looked, how proud I was, how much this day meant to me. But as I approached, Sarah's eyes met mine with something I'd never seen before. Not anger, not annoyance, but something worse. Indifference. Cold, calculated indifference. "There's no space inside, Mom," she whispered hurriedly, barely pausing in her conversation with the clipboard person. Her words were delivered like an afterthought, like she was telling me the weather forecast. "The seating chart is already set." She swept past me without another glance, her train rustling across the concrete steps, disappearing into the church where 200 other people apparently had space, but her own mother did not. I stood there on those stone steps, watching the heavy wooden doors close behind her, and felt something die inside me. Not dramatically, not with tears or screaming, but quietly, the way a candle flame goes out when there's no more oxygen to feed it. 23 hours of labor I'd endured to bring Sarah into this world. 23 hours of pain that I'd forgotten the moment they placed her tiny, perfect body in my arms. Sleepless nights when she had colic, years of scraped knees and broken hearts. College tuition paid with money I earned cleaning office buildings while she slept. Piano lessons, dance classes, prom dresses, graduation parties. Thousands of small sacrifices that had added up to this moment, standing alone on church steps while strangers filed past me into the warmth. I turned and walked away. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood something I'd been refusing to see for years. I wasn't a mother to Sarah anymore. I was an inconvenience. A leftover piece of her past that no longer fit into the glossy picture she was painting of her new life. The walk back to the subway station felt like walking through water. Everything moved slowly, sounds became muffled, and the October air cut through my dress like it was made of paper. I caught my reflection in a storefront window and saw an elderly woman with sad eyes and slumped shoulders, someone who looked defeated and forgotten. But that was just the beginning of my story. What happened next would change everything, though I didn't know it then. I was about to discover things about my family, about money that had disappeared, about lies that had been carefully constructed over years, and about my own strength that I didn't even know existed. The train ride home was a blur of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks. I kept replaying Sarah's words, searching for some other interpretation, some way they could mean anything other than what they clearly meant. But there was no ambiguity in "there's no space inside." There was no hidden message of love or regret. There was just rejection, pure and simple. When I finally climbed those 4 flights of stairs to my apartment, my legs felt like they were made of concrete. I unlocked my door and stepped into the silence that had become my constant companion. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across my small living room where photographs of my children and grandchildren stared back at me from every surface. I made myself a cup of tea, the same ritual that had comforted me through decades of disappointments. The kettle whistled, a lonely sound in the quiet apartment, and I poured the boiling water over the chamomile tea bag, watching the golden color bloom in the white cup. My hands were steadier now, though I couldn't say why. Sitting at my small kitchen table, I began to think about the pattern that had led to this moment. It wasn't just Sarah's wedding. It was years of small rejections, forgotten birthdays, canceled visits, conversations that ended abruptly when something more interesting caught their attention. When had I become so easy to dismiss? Sarah's older brother Michael lived in Manhattan with his wife and 2 children. He worked on Wall Street, something involving investments and stock market trading that I never fully understood, but that had made him wealthy enough to own a 3-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side. He called me maybe once a month, usually when he needed something. A babysitter for the kids when their regular nanny was sick. Someone to pick up his dry cleaning when he was working late. Small favors that I always agreed to because saying yes to Michael meant staying connected to my grandchildren. The last time I'd seen him was 3 weeks before Sarah's wedding, when he'd asked me to watch Emma and Joshua while he and his wife went to a charity gala. I'd taken the subway into the city, spent $12 on the round trip, and arrived at their apartment with a bag full of activities I'd planned for the kids. "Mom, you look tired," he'd said when he opened the door, though he'd looked right past me at his phone. "The kids are already fed. Just make sure they're in bed by 8. They'd left without a proper goodbye, rushing out in their expensive evening clothes while I helped Emma with her homework at their granite kitchen counter. The apartment was beautiful, all clean lines and modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but it felt cold, like a hotel room rather than a home. That night, after I'd tucked the children into their beds and read them stories, I'd sat in their living room surrounded by luxury I could never afford, feeling more alone than I did in my tiny Queens apartment. When Michael and his wife returned after midnight, they'd barely acknowledged me before calling a car service to take me home. "No, thank you for coming. No, we appreciate your help." Just a distracted goodbye and the assumption that I'd be available the next time they needed something. But it was my oldest child, David, who had hurt me the most deeply, though I was only beginning to understand the extent of it. David was 48, divorced, and struggling to make ends meet as a freelance contractor. He'd been living in my apartment on and off for the past 2 years, sleeping on my couch and promising it was just temporary while he got back on his feet. I'd supported David financially for years, even when my own savings were dwindling. Small loans that became large loans that were never repaid, rent money when his jobs dried up, car repairs, medical bills, even groceries when his unemployment benefits ran out. I'd told myself it was what mothers do. We help our children when they're in trouble. We sacrifice so they don't have to suffer. But sitting in my kitchen that evening after Sarah's wedding, I began to add up the numbers in my head. The calculations made my stomach turn. Over the past 5 years, I'd given David nearly $30,000. Money I'd earned working part-time at a bookstore until my arthritis made it impossible to stand for 8-hour shifts. Money from my late husband's life insurance policy that was supposed to secure my retirement. Money that had simply disappeared into David's various crises and emergencies. I stood up and walked to my bedroom, where I kept my important papers in a small fireproof safe my husband had bought years ago. My hands trembled as I entered the combination and pulled out the folder containing my bank statements. I rarely looked at them anymore. David had convinced me to set up online banking, saying it was easier, more modern. He'd helped me create passwords and security questions, always eager to make things simpler for his old-fashioned mother. The numbers on the printed statements told a different story than the one I'd been telling myself. Regular withdrawals, always for round amounts. 500 here, 1,000 there. Money that had been transferred electronically, with David's help, to cover his various emergencies. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were transfers I didn't remember authorizing. Large amounts moved to accounts I didn't recognize. I sat on my bed, surrounded by papers that documented my financial life, and realized I'd been systematically robbed. Not by strangers, but by my own son. The child I'd raised, fed, protected, and loved unconditionally had been stealing from me for years, and I'd made it easy for him by trusting him completely. The betrayal hit me harder than Sarah's rejection at the church. At least Sarah had been cruel openly, honestly. David had been stealing from me while I cooked his meals, washed his clothes, and worried about his future. He'd sat at my kitchen table, eating food I'd paid for with money he'd stolen from me, and listened to me worry about making ends meet. I thought about all the times I'd denied myself small pleasures because I thought I couldn't afford them. The winter coat I'd decided not to buy, wearing my old one for another season. The subscription to the magazine I loved, canceled because $15 a month seemed like too much. The dinners out with my friend Rose that I'd declined because I needed to save money. While I'd been pinching pennies and eating generic cereal, David had been living off my stolen money, probably spending it on things I couldn't even imagine. The betrayal made me feel sick, but more than that, it made me feel stupid. How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted so completely? I called the number on my bank statement even though it was after business hours. I needed to know the full extent of the damage, needed to understand exactly how much of my security had been stripped away. The automated system told me my balance, a number so low it made me gasp out loud. I was 3 months away from not being able to pay my rent. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my bed listening to the sounds of the city outside my window, sirens and car horns and the distant rumble of the subway, and tried to understand how my life had become so small and precarious. I'd raised 3 children, worked 2 jobs for most of my adult life, saved money whenever possible, and been careful with every dollar. Yet here I was, almost 74 years old, broke and alone, taken advantage of by the very people I'd sacrificed everything to support. The next morning, I called David. He was staying at his girlfriend's place, another temporary arrangement that had stretched on for months. When he answered, his voice was groggy, irritated at being woken up. "David," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk about money." There was a pause, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. "What about money, Mom?" "About the money that's been transferred from my account without my knowledge. About the $30,000 you owe me that you've never mentioned repaying. About the fact that I'm almost out of money and can barely afford to keep living in my apartment." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. Those transfers were for emergencies, remember? You told me to help you with the online banking because it was too confusing." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed him. Almost thought that maybe I was confused. Maybe my memory wasn't as good as I thought. But the bank statements in my hand told a different story. "David, there are transfers here for thousands of dollars that I never authorized. Money moved to accounts I don't recognize. Can you explain that?" His tone changed then, became defensive and angry. "Jesus, Mom, you're paranoid. Those are legitimate transfers. I was helping you invest some money, remember? In cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, that stuff that's making people fortunes. I was trying to help you build wealth. Bitcoin. I'd heard the word on the news. Something about digital money that went up and down in value like a roller coaster. But I'd never asked David to invest my money in anything. I'd been too afraid of losing what little security I had. "Where is this Bitcoin now?" I asked. It's complicated, Mom. The market is volatile. Some investments don't pay off right away. You have to be patient." I knew then that my money was gone. Not invested, not safely stored in some digital wallet, but simply gone. David had stolen it and spent it. And now he was lying about it with the same casual ease he'd shown when lying about where he'd been or what he'd done as a teenager. "I want you to come over tonight," I told him. "We're going to sit down and figure this out." "I can't tonight, Mom. I'm working late." Another lie. David hadn't worked a regular job in months. "Then tomorrow." "Look, I'll call you later, okay? I'm really busy right now." The line went dead. My own son had hung up on me when I'd asked him to explain where my life savings had gone. I sat in my kitchen, holding the silent phone, and felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and deep, but underneath it was something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Real, clean, clarifying anger. I called Sarah next. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe an apology for the day before, maybe an explanation. Her phone went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Sarah. I'm probably off living my best life, so leave a message and I'll get back to you when I can." The cheerful tone of her voice, so different from the cold indifference she'd shown me at the church, made me want to scream. "Sarah, it's your mother. I'd like to talk to you about what happened yesterday. Please call me back." She didn't call back that day, or the next, or the day after that. I would learn later that she and her new husband had gone to Hawaii for their honeymoon, posting pictures on social media of themselves on beaches and at expensive restaurants, living their best lives while I sat in my apartment wondering how I was going to survive the winter. It was my next-door neighbor who saved me from completely drowning in self-pity. Mrs. Klein was 81, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude who had lived in the same apartment for 40 years. She'd lost her husband the year before, and we'd bonded over our shared widowhood, sharing cups of coffee and complaints about the building's broken elevator. Mrs. Klein knocked on my door 3 days after the wedding, carrying a plate of rugelach and wearing a concerned expression. "Margaret, you look terrible," she said without preamble, pushing past me into my apartment. "What's wrong?" I broke down then, sitting at my kitchen table while Mrs. Klein listened to the whole story. The wedding, David's theft, Sarah's silence, Michael's casual use of my time and energy. I cried harder than I had in years, great heaving sobs that came from some deep place I'd been protecting for too long. Mrs. Klein didn't offer empty comfort or try to make excuses for my children. Instead, she made more tea and listened with the kind of attention I hadn't received from another human being in months. "You know what your problem is?" she said when I'd finished crying. "You think being a mother means being a doormat. You think love means never saying no, never putting yourself first, never demanding respect." Her words stung because they were true. "But Margaret, your children are grown adults. They don't need a mother who sacrifices herself for them anymore. They need a mother who shows them what self-respect looks like. And right now, you're showing them that it's okay to treat people like garbage as long as you're family." That afternoon, Mrs. Klein helped me call the bank and report the unauthorized transfers. She sat beside me as I explained to a customer service representative what had happened, her presence giving me strength I didn't know I had. The bank opened an investigation and helped me set up new security measures on my account. They couldn't guarantee I'd get my money back, but they could prevent further theft. Next, Mrs. Klein insisted we call her nephew, a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse. I'd never thought of myself as an abuse victim, but that's what I was. The lawyer, a kind man named Robert, explained that what David had done was a crime. He could help me pursue criminal charges if I wanted, or at least help me recover some of my stolen assets. The hardest part was accepting that my son was a thief, not struggling, not unlucky, not the victim of circumstances beyond his control, but a person who had deliberately and systematically stolen from his mother. Mrs. Klein held my hand as I signed the papers authorizing Robert to investigate David's finances. "He's been selling the Bitcoin," Robert explained after running some preliminary searches, "converting it to cash and using it for living expenses. There's not much left, but we might be able to recover something." That evening, Mrs. Klein and I sat in my living room surrounded by years of family photos, pictures of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduations, vacations, evidence of all the love I'd poured into these 3 children, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the dreams I'd had for their futures. "Do you know what I see when I look at these pictures?" Mrs. Klein asked. I shook my head. "I see a woman who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. A woman who was so afraid of being alone that she let herself be used and abused and taken for granted. A woman who confused love with servitude." She was right. I had confused love with servitude. I'd believed that being needed was the same as being loved, that sacrificing myself proved my worth as a mother. But my children had learned to see my love as weakness, my generosity as an entitlement, my presence as something they could take for granted. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made dinner just for myself. Not a large pot of something that would provide leftovers for David, not a meal designed to please someone else's tastes, but a simple pasta dish with vegetables that I liked. I set the table with my good dishes, lit a candle, and ate slowly, tasting every bite. It was the first meal I'd enjoyed in months. Over the next few days, I began to make other small changes. I threw away the magazines David had left scattered around my apartment. I rearranged the furniture so the couch where he'd been sleeping was no longer the focal point of the living room. I bought new sheets and pillows, small luxuries I'd been denying myself while supporting his lifestyle. When David finally called, 5 days after our conversation about the missing money, I was ready for him. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice carefully modulated to sound caring and concerned. "Maybe we should sit down and go through your finances together. I think you might be confused about some things. More gaslighting, more attempts to make me doubt my own memory and judgment." "David," I interrupted, "I've hired a lawyer. He's investigating the unauthorized transfers from my account. If you have something you want to tell me about where my money went, now would be a good time." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. "You hired a lawyer?" His voice had lost its fake concern and turned cold. "Against your own son? I hired a lawyer to help me understand where my life savings went. If you haven't done anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. This is unbelievable. I try to help you, and this is how you repay me? By accusing me of stealing? The manipulation was so transparent now that I wondered how I'd ever fallen for it. David, you took $30,000 from my account without permission. That's not helping. That's theft. He exploded then, screaming at me through the phone about how ungrateful I was, how everything he'd done was for my own good, how I was a paranoid old woman who didn't understand the modern world. He called me names I won't repeat, said things designed to hurt me as deeply as possible. And for the first time in my life, I hung up on one of my children. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, but I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. I'd finally stopped accepting unacceptable behavior. I'd finally said no. Mrs. Klein knocked on my door an hour later, carrying Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. I heard yelling, she said simply. I thought you might need some company. We ate lo mein and drank wine while I told her about my conversation with David. She listened without judgment, nodding at the right moments, making small sounds of understanding and support. You know what this means, don't you? She said as we finished the bottle of wine. What? It means you're finally growing up. I laughed then, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. She was right. At 73 years old, I was finally learning to stand up for myself. But my family wasn't done with me yet. 2 days later, Michael called. His tone was formal, businesslike, the way he spoke to difficult clients. Mom, David told me about your accusations. This is really inappropriate behavior. Hiring lawyers and making wild claims about stolen money. David was trying to help you invest wisely, and now you're attacking him for it. Michael, your brother stole $30,000 from me. There are bank records. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Maybe it's time to consider some kind of care facility, somewhere that can help you manage your finances more effectively. The threat was subtle but clear. Stop making trouble, or we'll have you declared incompetent and take control of your life completely. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I told him, and I won't be threatened by my own children. This isn't a threat, Mom. This is concern. You're obviously not capable of managing your own affairs anymore. I hung up on him too. That afternoon, I had my first meeting with a social worker that Robert the lawyer had recommended. Her name was Linda, and she specialized in helping elderly people who'd been financially abused by family members. She was young, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. What you've experienced is more common than you might think, she told me. Adult children stealing from elderly parents, using emotional manipulation to maintain control, threatening institutionalization to keep their victims quiet. You're not alone, and you're not crazy. Just hearing those words made me cry. For months, I'd been made to feel like I was the problem, like my needs and feelings were unreasonable, like my desire for respect and honesty was somehow selfish. Linda helped me understand that what I'd been experiencing was a pattern of emotional and financial abuse that had probably been going on for years, so gradually that I hadn't recognized it for what it was. She gave me books to read about boundary setting and self-advocacy, resources I'd never even knew existed. But the most important thing she gave me was permission to put myself first for once in my life. Sarah finally called me back 2 weeks after I'd left my message. She'd returned from her honeymoon tanned and relaxed, full of stories about swimming with dolphins and romantic dinners on the beach. She talked for 15 minutes without asking how I was or acknowledging what had happened at her wedding. So anyway, she said finally, we need to talk about Christmas. Brad's parents are coming and his sister and her kids, so we're going to need the dining room table extended. Can you help us set up and serve dinner? His family is kind of fancy, so we'll need everything to be perfect. The audacity took my breath away. She wanted me to serve Christmas dinner to her new in-laws after refusing me a seat at her wedding. Sarah, I said carefully, I think we need to talk about what happened at your wedding first. What about it? It was perfect. Everyone had such a good time. You told me there was no space inside. You wouldn't let me attend your own wedding. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had that familiar tone of impatience. Mom, it wasn't personal. The venue had limited seating, and we had to make difficult choices. Brad's family is much larger than ours, and they're paying for a lot of the wedding expenses. His parents insisted their extended family be included. More lies. More excuses. More reasons why everyone else's comfort and happiness mattered more than mine. So you chose to exclude your mother so Brad's distant relatives could attend? You're being dramatic, Mom. It was just one day. And now you're ruining my happiness by making it about you. Making it about me. The woman who'd given birth to her, raised her, supported her through every crisis and celebration, was being selfish for wanting to witness her daughter's wedding. I won't be helping with Christmas dinner, I said quietly. What? Why not? Because I'm tired of being treated like hired help by my own family. Because I'm tired of being excluded from the important moments, but expected to provide free labor for the inconvenient ones. Sarah's voice turned sharp, angry. I can't believe how selfish you're being. This is supposed to be about family, about coming together for the holidays, and you're making it all about yourself again. Again. As if I made everything about myself all the time, instead of spending decades making everything about everyone else. Sarah, when have I ever made anything about myself? Oh my God, Mom. You do this constantly. You guilt trip us about not calling enough, not visiting enough, not including you in everything. You act like we owe you something just because you're our mother. The words hit like physical blows. In Sarah's mind, my desire for basic respect and inclusion was emotional manipulation. My hurt feelings were selfishness. My need for love and connection was guilt-tripping. I do think you owe me something, I said, surprising myself with my honesty. I think you owe me basic respect and courtesy. I think you owe me the consideration you'd give to any other human being you claim to love. Well, that's your problem right there, Mom. Love shouldn't come with conditions and expectations. Real love is unconditional. The irony was breathtaking. Sarah, who had excluded me from her wedding, who called me only when she needed something, who treated me like an inconvenience, was lecturing me about unconditional love. You're right, I said. Real love is unconditional. But respect has to be earned, and relationships require effort from both sides. I've been giving you unconditional love for 30 years, Sarah. What have you been giving me in return? She couldn't answer that question, because we both knew the answer was nothing. Nothing but demands and expectations, and the assumption that I would always be available, always be grateful, always be willing to accept whatever crumbs of attention she chose to throw my way. I'm done with this conversation, she said finally. When you're ready to stop being bitter and start acting like a mother again, call me. The line went dead, and I realized that Sarah had hung up on me twice now. But this time, I didn't feel hurt or rejected. I felt free. That evening, Mrs. Klein and I went to see a movie at the small theater on Northern Boulevard. It was something I hadn't done in years, spending money on something purely for my own enjoyment. We bought popcorn and sodas and sat in the dark watching a romantic comedy that made us both laugh. How do you feel? Mrs. Klein asked as we walked home through the crisp December air. Lighter, I said, and I meant it. The weight of my children's expectations, their demands, their casual cruelty, was finally lifting from my shoulders. Christmas came and went without a single call from any of my children. I spent the day with Mrs. Klein and 2 other neighbors, sharing a meal we'd prepared together and exchanging small, thoughtful gifts. It was the most peaceful Christmas I'd had in decades. New Year's Eve found me in my apartment, alone but not lonely, reflecting on the year that had just ended and thinking about what I wanted from the year ahead. For the first time in my adult life, I was thinking about my own desires instead of everyone else's needs. I wanted to travel. I'd never been anywhere except for a few family trips when the children were young, always to destinations chosen by someone else, always focused on their entertainment rather than my interests. I wanted to see the ocean again, maybe take a cruise or visit a city I'd only read about. I wanted to learn new things. I'd always been interested in art, but had never had time to pursue it. I looked up classes at the community center and discovered they offered painting workshops for seniors. I wanted to make new friends. Real friends, like Mrs. Klein, who valued my company and treated me with respect and kindness. Most of all, I wanted to stop feeling ashamed of having needs and desires of my own. I wanted to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The new year brought unexpected developments. Robert, the lawyer, had made progress in recovering some of my stolen money. David had been forced to liquidate some assets, and I was going to receive about $8,000 back. Not nearly what he'd taken, but enough to give me some financial breathing room. More importantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence of David's other financial crimes. He'd been scamming elderly people online, using fake investment schemes to steal their savings. The authorities were building a case against him, and it looked like he might face serious consequences for his actions. I felt no satisfaction in my son's legal troubles, but I also felt no guilt. He'd made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. I was done enabling his behavior by protecting him from the results of his actions. In February, I enrolled in the painting class at the community center. The instructor was a woman named Patricia, retired from teaching art at the local high school, who had infinite patience for beginners. I discovered that I had a natural eye for color and composition, and that creating something beautiful with my own hands brought me joy I'd forgotten was possible. The other students in the class became my new circle of friends. We were all women over 60, all dealing with various life transitions and challenges. We supported each other's artistic efforts and began meeting for coffee after class, sharing stories and advice and laughter. For the first time in years, I had a social life that existed independently of my children's needs and schedules. I had friends who called me because they wanted to talk to me, not because they needed something from me. I had activities that brought me pleasure without any obligation to serve others. In March, I did something that 6 months earlier would have seemed impossible. I booked a week-long trip to Savannah, Georgia, something I'd dreamed of doing since reading a novel set there years ago. I'd never traveled anywhere alone, had never even considered it a possibility. Mrs. Klein helped me pack, both of us giddy with excitement over my adventure. She'd become not just a neighbor but a true friend, the kind of relationship I'd always wanted with my daughters but had never been able to achieve. "Are you nervous?" she asked as we folded my new clothes into the suitcase I'd bought specially for the trip. "Terrified," I admitted, but also excited. When's the last time I felt excited about anything? Couldn't remember. My life had been so consumed with worry and obligation, with meeting other people's needs and managing their crises, that excitement had become a foreign emotion. The flight to Savannah was my first time on an airplane in 20 years. I had a window seat and spent the entire flight staring down at the landscape passing below, amazed by the patterns of roads and fields and rivers that looked like abstract art from 30,000 feet. The city itself was everything I'd imagined and more. Cobblestone streets and historic squares, Spanish moss draping ancient oak trees, architecture that spoke of generations of human stories. I took a guided tour of the historic district, visited museums and gardens, ate at restaurants I chose simply because they looked interesting. But the most transformative part of the trip was the silence. For an entire week, no one needed anything from me. No one called with crises or emergencies. No one expected me to solve their problems or provide free labor. I woke up each morning with nothing but my own desires to consider, nowhere to be but exactly where I wanted to be. I painted watercolors of the squares and gardens, sitting on park benches in the warm southern air, talking to other tourists and locals who were friendly and interested in my story. I was just Margaret, not somebody's mother or grandmother or disappointment, just a woman who was learning to enjoy her own company. On my last day in Savannah, I sat in a cafe overlooking the river and wrote in the journal I'd started keeping. I wrote about the trip, about the paintings I'd made, about the conversations I'd had with strangers who treated me with more respect and kindness than my own children had shown me in years. But mostly I wrote about the person I was becoming, someone who said no when she meant no, someone who put her own needs first without feeling guilty about it, someone who understood that love without respect isn't really love at all. I flew back to New York feeling like a different person. Physically, I looked the same, but something essential had shifted inside me. I'd proven to myself that I could be happy independently of my children's approval or participation. I'd discovered that the world was full of people who would treat me well if I demanded to be treated well. Mrs. Klein met me at the airport, eager to hear about my adventures. We went back to my apartment, where she helped me unpack while I showed her the postcards and souvenirs I'd collected. The apartment looked smaller somehow, but also cozier. It was my space, arranged for my comfort, filled with things that brought me joy. That evening, as we sat drinking wine and looking at the paintings I'd made in Savannah, Michael called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up the phone. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Emma has a school project about family history, and she specifically asked to interview you. Can you come over this weekend?" The old me would have been thrilled by this crumb of inclusion, this small acknowledgement that I had value as a grandmother and keeper of family memories. The new me heard something different in his request. "What does Emma want to know about?" I asked. "Just family stuff. Where our grandparents came from? What life was like when you were young, that kind of thing. And you want me to come to your apartment to help her with this?" "Well, yeah. She needs it done by Monday, so this weekend would be perfect." No, please. No acknowledgement that he was asking me to give up my weekend plans. No consideration for the fact that I might have other things to do. Just the assumption that I would drop everything to help with a project he'd probably known about for weeks. "I'm sorry, Michael, but I'm not available this weekend." There was a pause. "What do you mean not available?" "I mean, I have other plans." "What kind of plans?" The question annoyed me. When had my schedule become something my children could interrogate and approve? "I'm taking a watercolor painting class and we have a special workshop this weekend at the Botanical Gardens." "You're taking painting classes?" His tone suggested this was somehow ridiculous. "Yes, I am. I'm quite good at it, actually." Another pause. "Mom, this is important. Emma specifically asked for you. Then you should have asked me more than 3 days in advance. If Emma wants to interview me about family history, I'd be happy to do it, but we'll need to schedule it for a time that works for both of us." I can't believe this. Since when do you put hobbies ahead of your grandchildren? Since I realized that my grandchildren only needed me when it was convenient for their parents. Since I understood that being a grandmother didn't mean being available 24 hours a day for whatever last-minute request came my way. Michael, I've been available for my grandchildren for their entire lives. I've babysat, helped with homework, attended school plays, given birthday gifts, provided free childcare whenever you needed it. I think I've earned the right to have my own schedule respected. This is really selfish, Mom. There it was again. The accusation of selfishness for having boundaries, for refusing to be taken for granted. What's selfish is assuming I have nothing better to do than wait around for your phone calls. What's selfish is giving me 3 days' notice for something you've probably known about for weeks. I hung up before he could respond, and immediately felt guilty about it. But Mrs. Klein, who had heard my side of the conversation, was nodding approvingly. Good for you, she said. He needed to hear that. The weekend painting workshop was wonderful. We painted outdoors in the botanical gardens, capturing the early spring flowers and budding trees. I was getting better at mixing colors and creating texture, and Patricia praised a landscape I'd painted of the rose garden. That evening, I had a message from Emma on my answering machine. Her young voice was disappointed but polite. Hi, Grandma. Dad told me you couldn't help me with my project this weekend. Could we maybe do it next weekend instead? I really want to talk to you about our family. The difference between Emma's respectful request and Michael's entitled demand was striking. I called her back and scheduled a time that worked for both of us. And the following Saturday, I took the subway to Manhattan with a folder full of old photographs and documents. Emma was 12 now, old enough to ask thoughtful questions and listen carefully to the answers. We spent 3 hours at Michael's kitchen table while she took notes and recorded our conversation on her phone. She wanted to know about her great-grandparents, about what it was like when I was young, about how I'd met her grandfather. But she also asked more personal questions that surprised me. Grandma, were you happy when you were raising Dad and Aunt Sarah and Uncle David? It was a complicated question, one I'd never really considered before. I was fulfilled, I said carefully. Taking care of your father and aunt and uncle gave my life meaning and purpose. But I'm not sure I understood then that it was okay to be happy just for myself, not just because other people were happy. Are you happy now? I thought about my painting classes, my trip to Savannah, my friendship with Mrs. Klein, the peaceful evenings in my apartment reading books I chose because I wanted to read them. Yes, I said. I'm happier now than I've been in a very long time. That's good, Emma said seriously. Dad always seems stressed out, and Mom is always busy with work or social stuff. Sometimes I think adults forget that they're supposed to enjoy life too. Out of the mouths of babes. Emma understood something that had taken me 73 years to learn. When Michael came home from his office that evening, he seemed different somehow. Less distant, more thoughtful. Emma showed me some of the stuff you talked about today, he said as I gathered my things to leave. I didn't know you'd started painting. There's a lot you don't know about me, I replied, not unkindly, but honestly. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him processing this idea. In his mind, I was Mom, a fixed entity whose only identity was in relation to him and his needs. The idea that I might have interests and talents and desires independent of my role as his mother seemed genuinely surprising to him. Maybe we could have dinner sometime, he said, just to catch up. I feel like we haven't really talked in a long time. I'd like that, I said, but let's plan it in advance. I have a busier social calendar than I used to. On the subway ride home, I reflected on the day. Emma's questions had helped me see how much I'd changed, how different my life looked now compared to 6 months ago. I was no longer waiting for my children to include me or value me. I was creating my own life, full of activities and relationships that brought me joy. But I wasn't prepared for what happened the following week. A woman I didn't recognize approached me after painting class, introducing herself as Karen, a reporter for the local newspaper. She'd heard about my story from Linda, the social worker who'd helped me after David's theft was discovered. I'm writing an article about elder financial abuse, she explained. It's more common than people realize, and most victims are too ashamed to speak publicly about it. Would you be willing to share your experience? My first instinct was to say no. Talking publicly about David's crimes felt like betraying my family, airing our dirty laundry for the whole world to see. But then I thought about other elderly people who might be going through the same thing, suffering in silence because they were too ashamed to ask for help. I agreed to the interview. The article came out on a Thursday morning, on the front page of the local section. The headline read, "Local woman fights back against financial abuse by adult son." There was a photograph of me in my apartment, surrounded by my paintings, looking calm and confident. The article told the whole story. David's theft, his lies about Bitcoin investments, the family's attempts to gaslight me into thinking I was confused or paranoid. It also talked about my recovery, the legal action I'd taken, and the new life I'd built for myself. By that afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. Other seniors who'd experienced similar abuse called to thank me for speaking out. A local television station wanted to interview me. The community center asked if I'd be willing to speak at their upcoming seminar on elder rights. But the call that surprised me the most came from Sarah. "Mom, I can't believe you talked to a reporter about our family business," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? All my friends are texting me about the article." "I talked to a reporter about elder abuse," I corrected her. "The fact that your brother is an abuser is family business. The fact that elder abuse happens to thousands of people is a social issue that needs attention. You made us all look terrible." I told the truth. If the truth makes you look terrible, maybe you should think about that. There was a long pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was different. Smaller, somehow. "Mom, I've been thinking about some of the things we talked about Christmas dinner and the wedding, and maybe I haven't been as considerate as I should have been." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was closer than Sarah had ever come to acknowledging that her behavior had been hurtful. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "Maybe we could have lunch sometime, just the two of us, to talk." I wanted to say yes immediately, to jump at this small opening, to be grateful for any crumb of interest from my daughter. But the old me would have done that. The new me had learned to be more cautious. "I'd like that," I said. "But I want you to understand something first. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. I won't accept being treated poorly just because you're my daughter. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be based on mutual respect." I understand. Do you? Because this isn't a negotiation, Sarah. I'm not desperate for your attention anymore. I'm happy with my life as it is. If you want to be part of it, you're welcome. But only if you can treat me with the same courtesy and respect you'd show to a friend. Another long pause. "Okay," she said finally. I think I'd like to try." We made plans to meet for lunch the following week at a small cafe near the community center. I chose the place, I chose the time, and I made it clear that I had other commitments afterwards, so our visit would have a defined endpoint. The night before our lunch, I felt nervous in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Part of me was hopeful that Sarah and I might finally have the relationship I'd always wanted. But a bigger part of me was protective of the peace I'd found, unwilling to let anyone disrupt it, even my daughter. I arrived at the cafe early and chose a table by the window where I could watch people walking by. Sarah arrived exactly on time, looking more subdued than usual. She'd dressed carefully, I noticed, in a simple dress rather than her usual designer clothes. She was trying in her own way to show respect. "You look good, Mom," she said as she sat down. "Different, somehow." "I feel different." We ordered our food and sat in silence for a few moments, both of us uncertain how to begin. "I read the article 3 times, Sarah said finally. "I had no idea what David had done to you. Why didn't you tell me? When would I have told you? When you called to ask me to serve dinner to your in-laws? When you hung up on me for asking to be treated with respect?" She flinched at that, but she didn't get defensive. "I deserve that." "Yes, you did. Mom, I owe you an apology, a real one, for the wedding, for Christmas, for all of it. I've been selfish and cruel, and I don't have a good excuse." The words I'd been waiting to hear for months. But instead of feeling vindicated or relieved, I felt sad. Sad that it had taken a newspaper article to make my daughter examine her behavior. Sad that she'd needed public embarrassment to develop empathy. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "It means something. But Sarah, an apology is just words. What matters is whether anything actually changes. What do you want to change?" It was a fair question, and I thought carefully before answering. "I want you to call me sometimes just to talk. Not because you need something. I want you to remember my birthday without me having to remind you. I want you to include me in your life because you want my company, not because you feel obligated. And I want you to accept that I have my own life now, with my own interests and commitments that matter to me." She nodded, taking notes on her phone like she was in a business meeting. "I can do that," she said. "But Mom, could you maybe tell me about this new life? I feel like I don't know who you are anymore." So I told her about my painting classes, about the friends I'd made, about my trip to Savannah and the trips I was planning for the future. I showed her photos on my phone of the paintings I'd created, the workshops I'd attended, the places I'd been. "You went to Savannah by yourself?" she asked, amazed. "I did, and I loved every minute of it." "But weren't you scared?" "Terrified," I admitted, but also exhilarated. It was the first time in my adult life that I'd done something just because I wanted to do it, without having to consider anyone else's needs or schedule. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at the photos of my paintings. These are really good, Mom. I mean, really good. I had no idea you were artistic. Neither did I. I never had time to find out. Because you were too busy taking care of us. Yes. She started crying then, quiet tears that she tried to wipe away discreetly. Sorry, she whispered. So sorry for taking you for granted, for making you feel like you didn't matter, for treating you like hired help instead of like my mother. A person, I corrected gently. You treated me like I wasn't a person with my own feelings and needs. You're right, and I don't know how to make up for that. You don't make up for it, I said. You do better going forward. That's all any of us can do. We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation Sarah and I had had in years. She told me about problems in her marriage that she'd never mentioned, about feeling overwhelmed with work and social obligations, about missing the closeness we'd had when she was younger. I think I was angry at you for being so available all the time, she said. Like it made me feel guilty for not needing you anymore, so I went too far in the other direction and acted like I didn't need you at all. It was more self-reflection than I'd ever heard from Sarah, and I found myself feeling hopeful despite my caution. I need you, she continued. Maybe not in the same way I did when I was little, but I need you as a friend, as someone who knows me and loves me anyway. I just didn't know how to ask for that without feeling like I was reverting to being a child. You can need me without using me, I said. There's a difference between wanting someone in your life and expecting them to sacrifice their own life for yours. When we parted that afternoon, Sarah hugged me properly for the first time in years. Not a perfunctory greeting hug, but a real embrace that lasted long enough to feel like she meant it. Can we do this again next week? She asked. I'd like that. Over the following months, Sarah and I began to build a new relationship. She called me regularly, not to ask for favors, but just to talk. She remembered my birthday and sent flowers. She asked to see my paintings and even bought one to hang in her apartment. Most importantly, she began to respect my schedule and commitments. When she wanted to get together, she called in advance and worked around my painting classes and social plans. She stopped assuming I was always available and started treating my time as valuable. But the biggest test came in December, almost exactly a year after she'd excluded me from her Christmas dinner. Mom, Brad and I were wondering if you'd like to spend Christmas with us this year, she said during one of our weekly phone calls. Just the 3 of us? I asked. Well, his parents will be there and his sister's family, but we'd love to have you join us. The old me would have been thrilled to be included, would have accepted immediately and gratefully. But the old me hadn't learned to ask the right questions. What would you like me to do to help? I asked. Nothing. I want you to come as a guest, Mom. I want you to sit at the table and enjoy the meal and be part of the family. I'll handle all the cooking and serving. Are you sure? That's a lot of work for you. I'm sure. I want to do this. I want to make Christmas special for you for once. I accepted her invitation, but with some trepidation. A year of changed behavior was good, but family gatherings have a way of bringing out old patterns. Christmas Day arrived cold and clear, with a light dusting of snow that made the city look like a postcard. I dressed carefully in a new red sweater I'd bought for the occasion and took the subway to Sarah's apartment, carrying only a bottle of wine and some gifts. Sarah's apartment looked beautiful, decorated with fresh garlands and twinkling lights. The table was set with her good china, and something delicious was cooking in the kitchen. Mom, she said when she opened the door, giving me that genuine hug I'd come to treasure. I'm so glad you're here. Come in, come in. Brad's family was already there, and Sarah introduced me proudly to the relatives I hadn't been allowed to meet at the wedding. They were polite and welcoming, treating me like an honored guest rather than an obligation. But the moment that mattered most came when we sat down to dinner. Sarah had seated me at the head of the table in the place of honor, and she raised her glass to make a toast. I want to thank everyone for being here today, she said, looking around the table. But especially I want to thank my mom, Margaret, for teaching me what real love looks like, for showing me that love means putting the other person first sometimes, but also that it means respecting yourself enough to ask for respect in return. She turned to look at me directly. Mom, I know I haven't always been the daughter you deserved, but I'm trying to be better. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself. I cried then, right there at the Christmas table in front of people I barely knew. But they were good tears, healing tears, the kind that wash away old hurts and make room for new possibilities. The dinner was delicious. The conversation was warm and inclusive, and for the first time in years, I felt like I truly belonged at a family gathering. When it came time to clean up, Sarah insisted I stay seated while she and Brad handled everything. This is your day to be taken care of, she said firmly when I tried to help. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Sarah and I sat on her couch drinking tea and looking at the twinkling Christmas tree lights. How was that? She asked. Did you have a good time? It was perfect, I said honestly. Thank you for making me feel so welcome. Thank you for coming. And Mom, thank you for fighting back when we treated you badly. I know it would have been easier to just accept it and keep the peace, but you standing up for yourself forced all of us to examine our behavior. It made us better people. She was right. My refusal to accept unacceptable treatment hadn't just changed my life. It had changed theirs too. By demanding respect, I'd given them the opportunity to become people worthy of respect. That night, back in my own apartment, I sat by the window looking out at the city lights and reflecting on how much had changed in 1 year. I thought about the woman who had stood on those church steps 12 months ago, broken and abandoned, and marveled at how far she'd come. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, times when I wondered if setting boundaries was worth the risk of losing my family entirely. There had been lonely nights when the silence felt overwhelming, when the old patterns of people-pleasing seemed safer than the uncertainty of self-respect. But here I was, on the other side of that dark period, and I was whole. Not just repaired, but stronger than I'd ever been. I had friendships based on mutual affection rather than obligation. I had hobbies that brought me joy and a sense of accomplishment. I had a relationship with my daughter that was built on respect rather than manipulation. Most importantly, I had a relationship with myself that I'd never had before. I knew who I was beyond the roles I'd played for others. I knew what I liked, what I wanted, what I would and wouldn't accept. I knew that I deserved love, but I also knew that I could be happy without it if it came with conditions that diminished me. David never apologized or acknowledged what he'd done. He was eventually convicted of elder fraud and sentenced to community service and restitution. The money he repaid helped, but more important was the validation that what had happened to me was real, was criminal, and was not my fault. Michael took longer to change than Sarah had, but eventually he began to make an effort. He started calling regularly, asking about my life, rather than just updating me on his. He began including me in family activities in advance, rather than at the last minute. Our relationship would never be as close as the one I'd developed with Sarah, but it became respectful and genuine. Mrs. Klein remained my closest friend and confidant. We traveled together sometimes, taking senior group tours to places we'd always wanted to see. We painted together, cooked together, laughed together over stories of our past mistakes and present adventures. She showed me what friendship could look like when it wasn't complicated by obligation or guilt. As spring arrived again, almost 2 years after that devastating wedding day, I found myself planning another trip. This time to Italy, to paint in Tuscany with a group from the community center. The old me never would have believed she could do such a thing. The new me couldn't wait to see what she might discover about herself in a new place. I've learned that transformation isn't a single event, but an ongoing process. Every day, I choose to respect myself, to set boundaries, to put my own needs on equal footing with everyone else's. Some days it's harder than others. Old habits of people-pleasing die hard, and there are moments when I catch myself falling back into patterns of putting others first at my own expense. But the difference now is that I catch myself. I recognize the warning signs of being taken for granted or treated disrespectfully, and I address them before they become entrenched patterns. I've learned that prevention is easier than cure, that maintaining boundaries is simpler than rebuilding them after they've been trampled. I think often about other people my age who might be going through what I went through. The shame, the confusion, the sense that maybe you're asking for too much when all you want is basic respect and consideration. I want them to know that it's never too late to change the dynamics of your relationships. Never too late to discover who you are underneath the roles you've played for others. The most surprising thing I've learned is that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish or difficult or unlovable. It makes you honest. It gives the people in your life the opportunity to love you for who you really are, not for what you can do for them. And if they can't or won't make that adjustment, then you learn something important about what your relationship was really based on. I'm 75 now, and I feel younger than I did at 73. Not physically, of course, but emotionally, spiritually. I feel like I'm just beginning to live the life I was meant to live, to be the person I was meant to be. It's never too late for that kind of rebirth. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the years I spent putting everyone else's needs before my own, the decades of self-sacrifice that left me feeling empty and unappreciated. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain I caused myself by accepting unacceptable treatment. I regret the opportunities I missed to develop my own interests and friendships. I regret the example I set for my children by showing them that love meant never asking for anything in return. But I don't regret the love I gave them. Even if it wasn't always healthy, even if it enabled some destructive patterns, it was real and it was meaningful. My children are better people today partly because they had a mother who loved them unconditionally, even during the years when I didn't understand the difference between love and servitude. What I wish I'd known earlier is that you can love someone deeply while still maintaining your own dignity. You can be generous without being a pushover. You can put your family first sometimes without disappearing as a person. You can be needed without being used. I wish I'd understood that respect isn't something you earn through self-sacrifice, but something you command by modeling it for yourself. People will treat you the way you teach them to treat you, and if you don't value yourself, they won't value you either. Most of all, I wish I'd known that it's possible to be happy independently of other people's approval or attention. The joy I've found in painting, in travel, in friendship, in simple solitude is something no one can take away from me because it comes from within. It's not dependent on someone else's mood or needs or schedule. This doesn't mean I don't still value my relationships with my children and grandchildren. I do, deeply. But now those relationships are additions to my life rather than the entire foundation of it. If Sarah doesn't call for a week, I don't spiral into worry about what I've done wrong. If Michael cancels a dinner plan, I don't take it as a personal rejection. I have my own life, full of activities and people and interests that fulfill me. The relationship I have with Sarah now is better than anything I could have imagined that day she denied me space at her wedding. It's based on genuine mutual affection rather than obligation. She calls because she wants to talk to me, not because she needs something from me. She asks about my paintings, my travels, my friends. She treats me like someone whose life and opinions matter. But perhaps more importantly, I've learned to be okay with the fact that not all of my relationships will transform the way Sarah's and mine did. Some people aren't capable of growth or change. Some people will always see others primarily in terms of what they can provide. Learning to accept this without taking it personally has been one of my greatest accomplishments. David contacts me occasionally, usually when he needs money or legal help. I listen politely and decline to assist, without anger or lengthy explanations. I've forgiven him. Not because he's earned forgiveness, but because carrying resentment was poisoning my own peace. But forgiveness doesn't mean trust, and it doesn't mean enabling continued bad behavior. Michael and I have found our equilibrium somewhere in the middle. He makes an effort to include me in family activities and to show interest in my life. I make an effort to be flexible and supportive when it doesn't cost me my own well-being. It's not the close relationship I once hoped for, but it's respectful and genuine. My grandchildren, especially Emma, have become sources of pure joy in my life. Emma is 15 now, and she often calls me to talk about school, friends, and her own artistic interests. She's taken up photography and sometimes asks me to model for her portraits of older women. Through her lens, I see myself as someone interesting and worthy of documentation, not just someone's burden or obligation. The article about my experience with elder abuse led to other speaking opportunities. I've talked at senior centers, community groups, and even a conference for social workers about the importance of recognizing and addressing financial abuse by family members. It's difficult to speak publicly about such painful experiences, but knowing that my story might help someone else find the courage to stand up for themselves makes it worthwhile. Each time I tell my story, I'm reminded of how far I've come. The woman who stood on those church steps, devastated by her daughter's rejection, seems like someone I used to know, rather than someone I used to be. She was broken, but she wasn't weak. She had reserves of strength she didn't know existed, and the courage to use them when she finally understood she had no other choice. I still live in the same small apartment in Queens, but it looks completely different now. Gone are the family photos that once dominated every surface, replaced by my own paintings and pictures from my travels. The furniture has been rearranged to create a studio space near the window where I work on my art. The colors are brighter, the atmosphere lighter. This isn't to say that I've erased my family from my life or my history. I still have photos of my children and grandchildren, still treasure memories of their childhoods and the joy they brought me. But those memories no longer define me. They're part of my story, not the whole story. I've created a life that would survive the loss of any individual relationship, including the ones with my children. This might sound cold or defensive, but it's actually liberating. When you know you can be happy independently, you're free to love without desperation, to give without resentment, to receive without feeling obligated. The painting class that started as a tentative experiment has become the center of my social world. Our little group has become like family to me, but a chosen family based on shared interests and mutual support. We celebrate each other's successes, comfort each other through difficulties, and share the kind of easy companionship that I never thought possible in my 70s. Patricia, our instructor, has become a particular friend. She's a widow too, and we bond over the challenges and freedoms of living alone after decades of marriage. She's the one who encouraged me to submit my paintings to a local art show, where I was shocked to discover that other people wanted to buy my work. The first time someone purchased one of my paintings, I cried in the car afterward. Not because of the money, though the $100 was nice, but because someone had found enough value in something I'd created to want to own it. After a lifetime of being valued primarily for what I could do for others, being appreciated for something I'd made just for the joy of making it felt revolutionary. I've sold several paintings now, enough to fund my travel adventures and art supplies without worrying about the cost. But more importantly, I've become someone who creates rather than just someone who serves. I bring beauty into the world instead of just cleaning up other people's messes. The travel has opened up possibilities I never imagined. Italy was magnificent, full of light and color and history that I soaked up like a sponge. I painted in Tuscan vineyards and Roman gardens, stayed in small hotels where the owners treated guests like family, made friends with other travelers who shared my sense of adventure and discovery. Next year, I'm planning a trip to Greece with Mrs. Klein. We're both fascinated by ancient history and excited about seeing the islands we've only read about in books. The planning itself has become part of the adventure, researching destinations and looking at travel blogs written by other seniors who refuse to let age limit their horizons. But perhaps the most important journey has been internal. I've had to unlearn decades of conditioning that taught me my value lay in my usefulness to others. I've had to practice saying no without explanation or apology. I've had to learn the difference between being helpful and being used, between being loving and being a doormat. Some of this unlearning has been painful. There have been moments when I've questioned whether I'm being too harsh, too demanding, too selfish. The old voices in my head still whisper sometimes that good mothers sacrifice everything for their children, that love means never putting yourself first, that wanting respect and consideration is asking too much. But then I remember how it felt to stand on those church steps, excluded from my own daughter's wedding. I remember the bank statements that showed my financial security disappearing into my son's lies. I remember the years of feeling invisible in my own family, valued only for what I could provide rather than who I was. And I know that the path I've chosen, difficult as it sometimes is, has led me to a life worth living. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm thriving. I'm not just enduring relationships that diminish me. I'm cultivating ones that celebrate me. I'm not just waiting for other people to give meaning to my life. I'm creating meaning for myself. The most profound change has been in my relationship with solitude. For decades, being alone felt like punishment, evidence of my failure to be lovable or interesting enough to keep people around. Now, solitude feels like sanctuary. My quiet apartment isn't a place where I wait for other people to need me. It's where I paint and read and think and dream and plan. I wake up in the morning eager to see what the day might bring, rather than dreading the demands it will certainly make. I go to sleep at night satisfied with how I've spent my time, rather than exhausted from giving more than I had to give. This shift in perspective has been worth all the difficult conversations, all the boundaries I've had to set, all the relationships I've had to let go. I think often about the message I want to leave with other people who might be struggling with similar situations. The first thing I want them to know is that it's never too late to change the patterns that aren't serving you. I was 73 when I finally learned to stand up for myself, and I still had time to create an entirely new kind of life. The second thing is that you don't have to choose between loving your family and respecting yourself. Real love thrives on mutual respect, and anyone who demands that you diminish yourself in order to love them isn't offering you love in return. They're offering you manipulation, disguised as love. The third thing is that you have more strength than you realize. I certainly never thought I was brave enough to confront my children about their treatment of me, strong enough to survive their anger and rejection, resilient enough to build a new life from scratch in my 70s. But when staying the same became more painful than changing, I found resources within myself that I didn't know existed. Finally, I want people to know that happiness is possible at any age, in any circumstances, if you're willing to do the work of discovering who you really are underneath all the roles you've played for others. The world is full of possibilities for connection, creativity, adventure, and growth, but you have to believe you deserve access to those possibilities. As I sit here now, in my brightly lit living room surrounded by my paintings and planning my next adventure, I sometimes think about that broken woman on the church steps and feel nothing but compassion for her. She was doing the best she could with the tools she had. She loved deeply, even if she didn't always love wisely. She gave generously, even when that generosity wasn't appreciated or reciprocated. But she was also trapped by her own limiting beliefs about what she deserved from life. She thought that suffering in silence was noble, that sacrifice without recognition was virtuous, that love meant never asking for anything in return. She was wrong about those things, but she was right about her capacity for growth and change. The transformation from that woman to this one hasn't been smooth or linear. There have been setbacks and moments of doubt, times when the old patterns felt safer than the new ones. Change is never easy, especially when it requires disappointing people you love. But the alternative was disappearing entirely as a person, and I finally understood that wasn't an option I could accept. I've learned that respect isn't something you can demand from others if you don't first give it to yourself. Self-respect isn't selfish, it's essential. It's the foundation on which all healthy relationships are built. Without it, you become a victim of other people's whims and needs, constantly adjusting yourself to accommodate their comfort while your own needs remain unmet. The journey from victimhood to empowerment required me to be honest about things I'd been avoiding for years. I had to admit that my children had learned to take me for granted because I'd taught them that my needs didn't matter. I had to acknowledge that my own fear of abandonment had led me to accept treatment that no one should have to tolerate. Most importantly, I had to recognize that changing other people wasn't my responsibility or within my power. All I could control was my own behavior, my own choices, my own responses to the way others treated me. That recognition was both terrifying and liberating. Today, on this quiet Sunday afternoon, as I prepare to end this story, I feel a deep sense of gratitude for the journey I've been on, even the painful parts, even the moments of despair and confusion, because they led me to discoveries about myself that I never would have made otherwise. I'm grateful for Mrs. Klein's friendship, which showed me what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than what I could do. I'm grateful for my painting classes, which gave me a creative outlet and a community of kindred spirits. I'm grateful for the travels that opened my eyes to how much beauty and adventure the world still had to offer. I'm even grateful for Sarah's cruelty at her wedding, because it was the catalyst that forced me to examine patterns I'd accepted for too long. Without that moment of devastating clarity, I might have continued sleepwalking through my life, waiting for other people to decide I was worth loving. But mostly, I'm grateful for the discovery that it was never too late to become the person I was meant to be. At 75, I'm more authentically myself than I've ever been. I know what I like, what I want, what I will and won't accept. I know that I'm worthy of love and respect, but I also know that I can be happy without them if they come with conditions that diminish me. This is the message I want to leave with anyone who has felt invisible in their own life, anyone who has given until they had nothing left to give, anyone who has wondered if asking for basic respect and consideration is too much to expect from the people they love. You are worthy of love that doesn't require you to disappear as a person. You are worthy of relationships that celebrate who you are rather than demanding that you become someone else. You are worthy of a life that brings you joy and fulfillment, not just tired satisfaction that you've met everyone else's needs. And if the people in your life can't or won't offer you these things, you have the power to create a life that includes them. It might require courage you don't think you have, changes that feel overwhelming, conversations that seem impossible. But the alternative, continuing to accept less than you deserve indefinitely, is far worse than the temporary discomfort of standing up for yourself. I wish I could tell every person over 60 who feels undervalued and overlooked that their story isn't over. There are still chapters to be written, adventures to be had, relationships to be built, talents to be discovered. Age isn't a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom and experience that can finally be used for your own benefit, rather than everyone else's. The woman who stood on those church steps thought her life was ending. She was wrong. It was actually just beginning. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Wondered if your love and sacrifice went unnoticed? Questioned whether you deserve the respect you crave? Have you ever found yourself giving more than you received? Making excuses for people who treated you poorly? Accepting crumbs of attention while longing for genuine connection? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and there are others who need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles. If this journey touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own worth and potential, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Sharing these stories helps them reach people who desperately need to hear that change is possible, that respect is achievable, that happiness doesn't have to wait for other people's permission. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for allowing me to share the most difficult and transformative period of my life. And remember, it's never too late to reclaim yourself, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, never too late to discover the joy that comes from living authentically. Your life is precious. Your needs matter. Your happiness is worth fighting for.